It's so nice to see you, Candace, and have the opportunity to speak with you today about your stunning ethnographic study called Martyrs and Migrants, Coptic Christians, and the Persecution Politics of U.S. Empire. I want to start the episode in our conversation by posing a question I think that will help viewers and listeners to sort of orient to what we're talking about. And the question is, what does it mean to carry a sacred homeland in your body when you can no longer return to it? I'd love to hear more about who you are and how your work responds to this question, how your profession as a professor and an anthropologist may respond to this question, and also how this book gets into the depths of the question.
Wow, that's such a profound question. Yeah. So, okay, I want to say from the outset that in addressing this question, which I'll try to be as concise as possible, but because it's a very heavy one, that I will tackle this from like an insider-outsider dynamic. And what I mean by that is, I grew up Polish Catholic in Buffalo, New York. And so like the materiality of Christianity has always been like, central to my own like faith growing up Catholic. And like whether it be, for example, we're coming up on Holy Thursday soon. And obviously there are different calendars between Orthodox churches and the Western churches. But for the Western churches, Holy Thursday is coming up soon. And for us, Polish Catholics from Buffalo, New York, we have this thing of like the 7 church visitations. And that's a kind of pilgrimage in and of itself. So this is all to say that I grew up in this sense of embodiment of being Polish Catholic from Buffalo. But that also meant that I didn't know really anything beyond my own kind of personal background and self. And so when I went to, in terms of Christianity, so when I went to Egypt when I was 17 for the first time for an Arabic language program, and I met this Coptic Orthodox family and this whole different Christian tradition, let alone in Orthodox Christianity writ large, I was fascinated by it and really shocked that I, didn't know beyond my own kind of personal background in, Polish Catholic background. And so this is all to say, like, when I discovered Coptic Orthodoxy, I saw a kind of kinship in this rootedness to like the place and to visitation to certain sites and to the materiality of the mass or the liturgy. I mean, much kind of almost stronger materiality, like in terms of like the senses, in terms of the use of incense, of bachur, of just the hymns and all of that. And so eventually several years later, I converted to the Coptic Orthodox Church myself because I saw just a deepening of my own kind of Christian faith. So that's the kind of insider-outsider dynamic in that I'm not Egyptian myself, but I saw this kind of deepening of a material connection to Christianity in a way that was strengthened through Coptic Orthodoxy. And so I want to say that from the outset that my engagement with like this project is obviously like a personal one, but for Egyptian Coptic Christians themselves, whether in Egypt or in diaspora, it's also very much like this kind of heaviness of like carrying those rooted connections to land and to monasteries and to holy sites and to sites of ancient and modern martyrdom. And, we can talk about this throughout the episode, but even thinking about a place like in Upper Egypt, Southern Egypt, like Akhmim, which it was kind of a key site of persecution under Emperor Diocletian. And until today, people say that, Coptic Christians say that you can see kind of the blood of the hundreds and hundreds of martyrs that were killed under Emperor Diocletian, like in the soil. So it is like that very material, like real sense that there is a presence there. And so like it's not necessarily a burden, but it's a different way of kind of orienting ourselves to this world and to understanding that Christianity is not just theology. It's not just the, debates at the Council of Chalcedon, for example, in the context of the Coptic Orthodox Church, but it is this very rooted presence, both in Egypt and its memory and transposition in diaspora, where we have now from like Texas to California, at least in the U.S. context, new monasteries and new kind of forms of like rooted material Coptic Orthodox forms in a diaspora context. So sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but there's
It's
a
great.
lot to
It's a
say
great
there.
answer. I wondered as you were describing your place of origin, growing up in Buffalo as a Polish Catholic American, if the greater kind of collective consciousness within the Polish community, if there is a large Polish diaspora in the United States, particularly in the area that you've just described, was that also part of your religious experience? Was a longing in some ways to return to the homeland of your ancestors?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I think it gets us into a different kind of material terrain, meaning like scholarly terrain in the sense that the histories of immigration to the US and quite frankly whiteness and white supremacy have really tried to like shed a lot of these immigrant histories like of their specificity. For like us Polish Catholics in Buffalo, our connections to like the specific Polishness of the tradition, I mean, are very weak because they have been, kind of strained over many, many years of, I mean, both intermarriage and things like that. But there is still this sense, at least in Buffalo, that being Polish is something specific. It has its own American flavor, of course, right? Like in terms of thinking about the Polish Americanness of being Polish in the United States and the perception of the homeland of Poland in a particular way. But, for example, Buffalo has this celebration the day after Easter called Dingus Day. Okay. This is not something that happens in Poland, but it was made in diaspora as like a holiday a couple of decades ago. More officially in Buffalo, they have one of the biggest parades to like celebrate kind of the renewal that happens after Easter. So this is all to say that I think for me also this project in some sense and like thinking about the connections between the Coptic diaspora and the homeland and then kind of vice versa of like migrants coming to the US and like experiencing like what it's like to be a racialized migrant in the US context as well and like what kind of assimilation means realistically politically socially etc religiously for this community. I almost you know I think personally see like myself like even contending with some of the issues that second generation folks have conveyed to me as well like in the US context. So this is all to say that I think that you're hitting on something really important for me personally in this project too, is that there has been all this kind of confusion growing up of what is my connection to Poland as well. There's less of a confusion I think for second and third generation Coptic Americans because it's so close
Hmm.
in terms of the time period because Copts started really in earnest coming since 1965, the Hart-Celler Act. And so it's a lot closer, but I can see, I mean, there even now is kind of cracks in the second and third generation of like, what is Egypt to us?
Hmm.
So you kind of see that happening even now of this kind of deterritorialization and seeing the United States as a new Coptic geography and what that really means ultimately for the tradition.
We're going to get into some direct conversations around the importance of pilgrimage within the Coptic community and some events that shaped how pilgrimages either were engaged in or remembered, or violence that occurred during pilgrimages. And it's probably helpful for us to understand a bit of the history of Coptic individuals in the United States. You said that the migration really started in the 60s. Why is that? What was going on during that time that really precipitated this mass migration?
Yeah, so Coptic Christians did start immigrating in the 1980s, meaning it was a very small group of people. There is a scholar out of Canada, Michael Ecledios, who works on that very early migration period. But it was a group of scholars who got scholarships to be educated in the United States, end up teaching, etc. But they were supposed to go back to Egypt because at the time, basically, traveling immigration was very closed under Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the first president after the revolution in 1952. But it's really 1965 when there is a new immigration act that opens destroys the quota system and allows people from the global south to come to the United States. And Egypt and Egyptians are one of those kind of groups of people that came to the U.S., very much in earnest after that period. So we see in the 1970s and 1980s, of course, for economic reasons, because the Egyptian economy was transforming and going through a period of crisis. But also in the 1970s and 80s, there was a huge spike in like sectarian violence and just anti-Christian violence in Egypt that definitely influenced the push of people out. So compounded with these economic issues as well as issues of, minority discrimination, we see, more Copts coming to the United States. So there's that. And then in the 90s, after 1990 and the passing of basically the act that opened up the program called the U.S. Diversity Visa or Green Card Lottery, we see a new wave of Coptic migration to the United States. Obviously, it's a lottery system. So for economic reasons, but as well as these other reasons that I just talked about, because these kind of waves of violence have occurred, over decades. There might be lulls, but they return. And so we see kind of migration wave pushes in the aftermath of these waves of violence, including after the 2011 Egyptian revolution, which is what this book, primarily focuses on, that migration.
For people who may not have an understanding of what a Coptic person is or Coptic Christianity is, can you give, it's hard to give a 2,000-year overview, but I think it's important to position the experience of Copts within the origin story of Christianity.
Yeah, thank you for prompting that because it is quite important. So Coptic Christians are one of the oldest, the earliest Christian communities in the world. The church is stated to be founded by Mark the Apostle, Saint Mark. So in the early years after Christ's death, and thereafter, Alexandria becomes the center of theological learning. It's one of the C's, the first C's of Christianity. Egypt goes through waves of persecution under the Roman Empire, as I mentioned earlier, under Emperor Diocletian, in which Egypt experiences, obviously, its centrality of being a geography of martyrdom from those, that early period. And the Coptic calendar actually starts with the era of Diocletian, the era of the martyrs. And thereafter, obviously, after the Roman Empire becomes the Holy Roman Empire, and there are theological transformations, etc. In 451 A.D. is kind of like the first marker of difference for what becomes the Coptic Orthodox Church, which is the Council of Chalcedon. And at the Council of Chalcedon, without going into too many, it's a very thorny issue for many, but let's just say that it was over the nature of Christ, Christology, and there was basically a split between what eventually becomes the Coptic Orthodox Church and its clergymen and the Byzantine Empire and basically the rest of Christendom. So thereafter, Egypt the Coptic Orthodox Church as a church becomes kind of isolated in Egypt. And so when the Arab conquest happens that brings Islam to Egypt in the 7th century, the late 7th century, Egypt becomes obviously transformed and Coptic Christianity along with it. Eventually in the 12th century, Egypt becomes a majority Muslim over several centuries of kind of, social, cultural, religious kind of pressures that convert many Coptic Christians to Islam. And obviously subsequent persecutions take place depending on kind of the imperial rule at the time and the person who is ruling Egypt. So going into the modern period, the Coptic Orthodox Church really it has, sits heavy on these centuries of kind of persecution and pressures, imperial pressures, etc. And then European colonialism happens, British colonialism of Egypt, that fully transforms the church into what it is really today, meaning that in terms of its understanding of its own tradition as an Orthodox church, education, religious education, understanding of like what proper pilgrimage looks like and things like that. And those have had kind of ramifications until today. So this is all to say that the Coptic Orthodox Church and Coptic Christians are one of the largest remaining communities, Christian communities in the Middle East, the largest because of its size in Egypt. And it has had this kind of othered perspective, Christian perspective throughout its history, experiencing both martyrdom, but waves of persecution as a minority tradition.
So, and it sounds like many iterations of erasure
Yes.
that have led to the present. It's probably appropriate now to hear an overview of your book so then we can get into some specific discussions around your research and around these other variables that you have just mentioned.
Yeah, that sounds great. So I'll just kind of start with an opening kind of frame for the book, which is essentially that kind of over the past 2+ decades since really the 90s, we have, American politicians, Western politicians, think tanks, NGOs really mobilized around saving Middle Eastern Christians as there's been an increase of, violence against these communities in the wake of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the context of Iraqi Christians, the Arab Spring, the emergence of ISIS. And these narratives of Christian persecution often cast these communities as like exemplars of Christian resilience, glorifying both, as I kind of noted, their ancient character or their modern day martyrs, as we'll kind of get into in this conversation. And yet, when those communities kind of migrate to the West, they face, ironically, new forms of exclusion. And that's where Martyrs and Migrants really kind of takes up the story. So, as I mentioned, Coptic Christians are the largest remaining community in the Middle East, and they're central to this story, specifically since the 1980s. And as I noted, there's new waves and, of Coptic Christian immigrants to the U.S. in the 1970s. So in the 80s, we see the glorification of kind of Coptic martyrs in the American religious imagination, shaping this theology of the persecuted church, which is very much an American evangelical theology, but has been taken up by many others, which claims that Christians globally are facing unparalleled persecution. And what's ironic about this is that, one of the targets of missionary activity, Coptic Christians, are now cast as a kind of spiritual kin, fellow Christians suffering for their faith. And we have these images, I mean, in some ways, circulations like a pilgrimage of the bloodied, Coptic bodies and their hagiographic accounts circulating widely within both the evangelical conservative Christian networks and what I call in the book an economy of blood. And what I argue about this economy is that it organizes kind of kinship, or like who sees the other as like a Christian, as one of their Christian brethren, and difference through both kind of theological and racial evaluations of blood. Like theologically, blood is, obviously signifies the shared blood of Jesus Christ that unites Christians in salvation and suffering. But politically, this shared sense of kind of persecution is very uneven, as the book tries to kind of detail. So Coptic suffering is taken up by American evangelicals and many others as this like triumphant vision of mainly Western Christendom. Like their persecution is mapped onto an American Christian train that sees specifically white Christianity as under threat. And in this framing, the shedding of Coptic blood, Coptic martyrs, becomes this bond, this theological political bond where Coptic blood, Coptic martyrdom is imagined as Western Christian blood, shared in a global struggle against persecution. But on the opposite end, blood is also carries racial power. And in migration, Eastern Christian traditions, they are entangled through this migration with the historical fusion of Western Christianity and whiteness. And in the US, Middle Eastern Christians, so Copts included, are both racialized as Christians, like as Christian kin, and as non-white Middle Eastern Muslim adjacent others. And so they have this dual position where they are both embraced in narratives of global persecution, yet they're marked in daily life as foreign, as suspect, specifically in the shadow of the war on terror, which the book very much kind of details. So in this current context of migrant securitization, and I just had an article come out with the conversation about this today, cops a few years ago were crossing the southern border. Cops are undocumented, etc. And in this way, they're no longer, when they are captured by ICE or other forms of immigration enforcement, they're no longer imagined as heroic and historic martyrs, but as these racialized migrants threatening the sanctity of white Christian nation. And so, so American Christians will mobilize Eastern Christian suffering as kind of a moral resource for nationalistic narratives in the U.S. context, but these Eastern Christians ultimately remain Eastern, non-white bodies that are excluded and surveilled. And this has an impact on Coptic politics in the U.S., which the book also kind of talks about, whether that be kind of campaigns against LGBTQ curricula in New Jersey to the policies of somebody like Marty McCady, who is the Coptic Christian and serving as our FDA commissioner in the current Trump administration and one of the leaders of the Maha movement. So both of these are informed by like a transnational politics of persecution that ties these domestic conservative movements to kind of global Christian imaginaries. And so within the economy of blood, going back to Egypt, persecution in Egypt becomes kind of a central resource for diaspora claims making, identity formation, political orientation among Copts here in the US. And those narratives of suffering are mobilized to assert belonging, shape advocacy agendas, and also align with broader US foreign policy frameworks around international religious freedom, et cetera. But these dynamics also reshape kind of communal identity, religious tradition, and often distance Copts racially, I would argue, religiously, politically, from kind of broader Egyptian and I'm saying, particularly Muslim communities with whom they once shared life with in Egypt. Of course, like in elements of, conflict and violence, et cetera, but that they were their neighbors. So while violence against Copts in Egypt is very real and significant, there is this narrow focus on these episodes of violence that often obscures this very complex interreligious relationship that actually categorizes these histories. So the book follows these tensions from both Upper Egypt to the post 9/11 landscape of the New York, New Jersey area, and then finally to the American South and Nashville, arguing basically that Copts must kind of migrate and navigate their minority status in Egypt alongside this new racial religious positioning within American conservative Christian landscapes. And their efforts to kind of reconcile these dual positions shaped very distinct and often conservative political orientations. So just to kind of conclude, it's important to note, though, that when I'm saying that it shapes their conservative orientations, like this is not simply like a story of, instrumentalization, co-option, or resistance even, but like Coptic migrants are not passive instruments of power or empire, nor are they like uniform critics of it. Their lives are very complicated. And this is all to say that imperial power of the United States shapes both here and in Egypt, like their identities, politics, religious traditions even, and in very uneven and contradictory ways. And so the book is really just trying to contend with that, both ethnographically across these sites and really try to unfold what this migration has meant for this, very old Christian tradition.
Thank you for condensing years of work into this overview. So I was just talking with Dr. Evan Sullivan on an episode about blind veterans from World War I who were a marginalized community. And I'm listening to you speaking about Copts in Egypt, but also in the United States, and how their suffering has been beneficial. So there's this idea that we are invested in both the suffering and in the thriving of a community that is on the margins, because there's some type of redemptive narrative or personal cathartic redemption that happens when we can see such communities in this tension of suffering and thriving. And I'm wondering about your thoughts around this.
Yeah, that's a question. So, suffering and thriving. I mean, the suffering is very clear, obviously, within the book. And I think the thriving aspect would be bifurcated into two kind of tracks, both in Egypt and the US. The thriving aspect would essentially mean what it does here, in that we have somebody like Marty McCady and many others that are in and around the Trump administration that are Coptic Christian and other Middle Eastern Christians. And that is seen as kind of a Middle Eastern Christian thriving
Mhm.
because of its assimilation into certain, logics and forms. But like, let's say, for example, the end of the book talks about an organization in Nashville, Tennessee, the Al Mahabba Center, which really tries to think like, no, we have shared issues of concern around class dynamics with other racialized and at times, many times, not Christian migrant communities that are facing the same kind of class issues that we are. But that is not going to necessarily be seen as thriving by the same people who American Christians, whether they be conservative or not, that really champion and see Coptic martyrs in Egypt and elsewhere as kind of moral exemplars. So I think in that question, it's really about, what a politics of thriving, what is the possibility of a politics of thriving for Coptic and Middle Eastern Christians outside of these narratives of essentially what I describe in the book as like a conservative politics of US empire, because otherwise they're kind of seen as not necessarily, they might be Christian, but they're not the Middle Eastern Christians that we're talking about. In the Egyptian context, though, this kind of economy of blood of seeing Christians thriving is interesting because there is this kind of tension, I think, within the American, I'm talking about non-Coptic, non-Middle Eastern Christian political landscape of both wanting to bring Middle Eastern Christians to the US to save them. So we had this, comment from Ted Cruz about 10 years ago where he's like, we need to prioritize Syrian Christian refugees to the US. So we have like that rhetoric, but then we have other people like our current Vice President J.D. Vance, who many times, talks about the ways in which the U.S. Occupation of Iraq led to the complete decimation of Christian communities there, and that we need to, help the Christian communities there. Mike Pence, former vice president, also, tried to do the same thing. And so there's this kind of tension between, I think, supporting their immigration, but also in kind of an implicit isolationist like policy wanting them to stay there, and how to imagine them as thriving but not necessarily materially support them. So there's these like kind of layered tensions about, I think, that question of both reverence of their suffering but also what are the possibilities of Middle Eastern Christian thriving as Middle Eastern Christians.
It seems like this would be an important aspect of what you mentioned around conservative or evangelical Christian financial support for these Christian kin, that being able to conceptualize the suffering as alleviated because of the generosity, that seems to be important.
Yeah. Yeah. And so obviously there are a bunch of different NGOs that are not necessarily just evangelical. Many of them are Episcopalian, et cetera, that give actually specific financial support to Christian communities, especially in Iraq post ISIS and kind of rebuilding and things like that. But I want to say that in terms of financial support, I think that there's more kind of political rhetoric and support than there is necessarily financial. And so, like, let's just take is since obviously we're talking about Coptic Christians, let's take that as an example. If there is evangelical support, it's going to be for those Coptic Christians that ultimately convert to Protestant Christianity. So there are many other layered dynamics to this as well, in like the reverence of Coptic Christians as martyrs, which I talk about in the book and in their death. But in them as living Christians, there is this tension, I think, for many American evangelicals to see them as actually their Christian kin in life. So
Yeah,
what this
that makes sense. That
yeah,
they're Christians with their own agency who, despite support, whether that's financial or moral, or other types of prayer support, that they still remain Christians in their own tradition. That, yeah.
yeah, just to kind of note this, every time I give a book talk, if there are kind of Coptic Christian students in the audience, and this question has been made, posed to me more than once, or it's really a comment just to say that, I appreciate the book, but I also, want to say that I really see when I go to evangelical youth events, for example, or Protestant, youth meetings, um, that they will acknowledge my Coptic Christianity like as, a strong ancient tradition, but then they will also kind of emphasize that they want me to convert to the true church, which is their church. So there's a lot of disconnect and irony there, I think.
Is that also what you hear from people that you're interviewing within these communities in the United States?
To be honest, that did not come up as much like during my research. I wonder why that is, but I probably know why that is. A lot of the students that I've encountered might be, especially in a university setting, like more open to just Christian fellowships more
Mhm.
broadly. Whereas most of the folks that I interacted with, one, were a little bit older than college age. Of course, like I was, hanging out and seeing college age youth as well. But many of the folks that I was hanging out with were either single men that came to the United States, like, and claimed asylum in their late 20s, early 30s, or families in their 30s and 40s or older than that as well, navigating these like kind of processes. But what I will say is that there's a lot of kind of the Coptic communities in the US, this is all to say, the Coptic communities in the US are also very much kind of their own um, geographies, own, what can I say, like organizations, meaning that, many Coptic youth like they're not going to Protestant meetings for the most part. They're hanging out at their own meetings. So they're dealing with
Yeah,
their
that
own
makes sense.
internal dynamics. But in a university setting, you're going to have a lot of
Mhm.
Coptic students and youth, especially if there's not a Coptic club, that are going to other Christian youth organizations. And what do they encounter there?
I don't wanna paint with a very broad stroke here, all of Coptic, Christians in the United States, but uh, are there specific churches that have been built or religious centers, that provide, um, sort of a central place to orbit for many of these immigrant families and individuals?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. And it kind of gets to what I'm alluding to in like my previous answer, in that like the churches are their own worlds, okay? Meaning that there are not just youth meetings, adult meetings, etc. There's hymn classes, there's, hangouts, there's retreats. Like it is its own entity in and of itself. It's its own world. Don't need a world outside of it in many cases. Not to say that, all Coptic communities are like that. But in, for example, the church communities that I hung out with the most, like in New York and New Jersey, it is very much its own world. And, you know, youth grow up together. They're each other's best friends. Like they, go to college together. They go to pharmacy school together. They go, so it is its own kind of its own world in many ways.
Is there a sense with members of these communities that returning to Egypt on a pilgrimage, or maybe it's called something else, is an important part of their hope for the future, or that even maybe they would want to move back to their homeland permanently?
That is also an excellent question. The moving back is an interesting addition to that, though, because Um, I think that there are many, and I'll answer that more briefly first, is that there are many, I think, Egyptian American, Coptic American youth that do go back to Egypt for like a period of time. But there's not like a specific movement to say, oh, let's go back and live in Egypt. Like there is a specific movement I'm working with mainly Assyrian and Chaldean Christians for my new book project. And there is actually a specific movement called The Return to bring Christians back to northern Iraq. But in the case of Egypt, because Iraq is a different case in which you don't have people that are going on yearly trips, for example. So the return is a move to live there permanently, but you do have a Coptic American youth who are going on yearly visits. So they might not say it as, and I was speaking with actually my husband about this yesterday, because pilgrimage is not necessarily like a term. I mean, I'm thinking about the Arabic term, ziyara, which is like a visitation, like a visit, to somewhere. So it's actually more, it's less this thing unto like that's separated and more of like an everyday thing, if that makes sense. Like there's not this kind of, I think, like maybe secular separation between like these are religious and like secular spaces for many like Copts in Egypt specifically, but also you see this in like kind of diaspora trips back to the homeland too. And what I will say is like a great organization that does these kind of return trips, some of them visitation, some of them service, is Coptic Orphans, that really brings second and third generation Coptic youth like back to especially rural areas of Upper Egypt and elsewhere, both to teach English to youth, like very, poor youth in villages across Egypt South. Which is an amazing program. It's called Serve to Learn. But also very particularly to this conversation, they have this new program called the 21, which basically is trying to bring Coptic American youth to Egypt to see these martyrdom pilgrimage sites. Focus on the 21 martyrs of Libya, 20 Copts and one Ghanaian man in February of 2015 who were beheaded by ISIS affiliates. And that particular image kind of circulated, around the world of them on their knees in orange jumpsuits being prepared to be beheaded. And so that image not only captured American Christians, I mean, Christians around the globe, but also Coptic American youth who then, go on this trip to rediscover kind of their spiritual connection to the tradition and its rootedness in Egypt.
I do want to ask you some particular questions about pilgrimages, and this is actually tied to one of them, the martyrdom videos which I remember very vividly. And when I was reading about this, I was reflecting back to my thoughts at the time. I mean, it was so gruesome, the videos, and I think it was probably one of the first times I had seen such a video. I do not remember fully in thinking back that I don't recall that I knew that they were Coptic. And maybe I did, but I just didn't place what it actually meant, what was actually happening and why. And I wondered about your thoughts around how this series of videos and how rapidly they spread, if this kind of caused an inverted pilgrimage. So it's a drawing out rather than a going towards a specific place.
Yeah, and what you mean by that in terms of a drawing out, meaning that the video itself is kind of like being like not absorbed, but like kind of taken into almost like the heart of the person
Yes.
watching it.
Yes. So it comes inward rather than the person moving towards that sacred space.
Yeah, and I think that's such a new and interesting way to think about it because yeah, the video itself, which I think, I mean, within a few days or something like that was taken down. But I remember myself like watching it and just, I think being, um, I think just horrified, like by just, yes, there's no words to describe it. I remember like even myself like watching it and being just absolutely, I don't know, speechless. And so like the images like that circulated after were not obviously of the moment that they did what they did. Um, but the kind of moments of defiance. And I think that beyond like the video itself, which was taken down, so like many people didn't end up seeing it. I do want to say that in Egypt itself, like Egyptian cops, I don't think ever really took it down. Just to say that it was mostly in diaspora that I'm talking about, but it was the images of defiance that I think really until today like bring people in, meaning like the image of the 21 on their knees, and especially the few of the men who have their heads up. And those particular images of defiance and readiness for martyrdom, I think, until today, like really draw people in to the bravery, but also like just the witness of that moment. And I think, nearly now 11 years later, like it's still such a powerful image, I think, for so many people. I mean, cops and non-cops, because of like that moment of kind of defiance and actual courage to do so. Like, I just want to kind of point out that obviously ISIS did many of these videos. Okay. A few weeks later, there were 30, I believe. Yeah, I think 30 or 28 Ethiopian Orthodox men who were beheaded on the shores of Libya as well. That video did not get as much circulation. There's ways that we can think about as to why, in terms of racial dynamics and things like that, but as well as Assyrian Christians, etc. This is a pattern that like ISIS affiliates did over time. But I think of the um, presence of the 21 Copts like on the shore and Coptic Christians as having this history of it is a church of the martyrs, and the dynamics internal to Egypt that allow for the narrative of martyrdom to be so connected and tangible for the tradition itself, allowed, I think, that specific context to be so powerful for many Christians around the globe and until today.
And also the message that this is the enemy that we're all facing, and
Yes.
our own fate could be caught up in this, and look at this is the first line of martyrs, but who's next?
Absolutely. I mean, in one of my slides, and I talk about in the introduction to the book, this tweet from Eric Metexas, who is an American evangelical, like, commentator, kind of political figure of sorts, who used the image of the 21 with their names to kind of position the kind of Trump supporters that were going to the Capitol insurrection. This is 2021, the next day, of like, what are you willing to, what price are you willing to pay for what you believe in? So there is this way in which like the image of the 21 like gets taken up like beyond its own specific context, not just for kind of Christian witness, but also like what are you willing to die for as well. So it has become this image beyond its own context, and the own
Yes.
context of the fact that those were 21, I mean, specifically 20 Egyptian Coptic migrants from the poorest areas of Upper Egypt that were just in Libya to make a living for their families, and willing to die for uh, supporting them.
I think you have some other slides to show our viewers who are watching this on YouTube some other pilgrimage points, or some other intersections here between pilgrimages and the Coptic community, and I'd love to see those and hear about those.
Yeah, so I just wanted to share two kind of examples of like newer pilgrimage sites of like modern day martyrs in Egypt. So I just mentioned the 21 martyrs of Libya. So the 20 Coptic migrants have their own what is known as in Arabic a mazar, or basically a site in which like their material from their bodies, like the orange jumpsuits, their identification cards, etc., are in this space in their village of Al Awar, which is in Upper Egypt and Minya. And so it is this very intense complex. And what I mean by that intense, it's spiritually intense because there are many visitors from around the globe that, I mean, not just Coptic Christians and also the Coptic like families of the martyrs that obviously, visit the site almost daily or weekly. It is a huge church next to the site in which you have these kind of material forms in which people, and you see in this photo that, the room is usually packed with people who are, touching the glass under which there are their coffins, as I said, their clothing, just material forms from their lives, and they're touching it for blessings. There's also, when I visited, people who are, singing hymns or kind of like hymns of remembrance for the 20 Coptic martyrs, and a site in which like they are all kind of buried as well. And so it is definitely this pilgrimage site, but it's kind of more than that. It's almost this international, just Christian place that people from around the globe circulate to hear from the martyrs' families, to just get kind of a glimpse of these important Christians of witness in the modern period. And along the walls, like you can't see totally in like the photo, but along the walls there are basically like media clips of remembering these martyrs. There's a whole kind of section in which we have Pope Francis, describing the martyrs as martyrs for all Christians. The 21 are a part now of Roman Catholic martyrology, which is the first in the history of the Roman Catholic Church to have basically a community that is not in communion with the Catholic Church to be known as martyrs for the Catholic Church. So that's kind of one photo I wanted to share. But there is another one that's a little less formal, and it comes from a monastery in Wadi Natron, Deir Amba Bishoy, Saint Bishoy. And outside of it, there are many different kind of mazars or like areas of visitation, and some of them are kind of what I would describe as like informal, like makeshift areas of commemoration. And in this image, we have basically a cutout of Abuna Arsenios, who was martyred by somebody in Alexandria a few years back, around the around the time of COVID, in which a Muslim in Alexandria, when they were doing kind of service to the community, came and stabbed him in the neck, and he bled out on the street, basically along the Mediterranean Sea and the Corniche of Alexandria. And he was very, much known to be such a kind and generous priest. And so we see this kind of makeshift area of commemoration for him at Deir Amba Bishoy. And you have many of these different kind of places in which it might not be official, meaning like that the Coptic Orthodox Church doesn't have like a concrete mausoleum or anything like that, but these are spaces that are used as a point of memory for these modern day martyrs over the past like 15 years around Egypt.
What are some of the practices that people who either call themselves pilgrims or visitors, are they leaving objects at the site? Do they pray? Is there a sense that the martyr will respond or intercede? Can you talk about what that looks like?
Absolutely. That's a great question. I think especially at these sites, there are several things that people do. Of course, there's prayer. 100%. There are points of prayer um, along many different sites of pilgrimage. So not just for kind of modern day martyrs, but there are mausoleums or mazars for um, the most recent patriarchs of the Coptic Orthodox Church, Pope Krolos, who is seen as basically this pope of miracles. And his mazor in Wadi Natron as well is a place in which like you have to wait in line to go and see like where he's, his mausoleum, where he's buried. And people just sit there, sometimes put their children on top of the mazar to like and move them back and forth to kind of like, draw out like blessings like from him. It's also covered in plastic too, because it's a way in which to kind of preserve like the mausoleum itself, but knowing that there's so many people who come through there and just like want to touch to receive like blessings or barakah from the Pope saint. And they also leave pieces of like white paper that people write out their prayers to, whether it be the martyr saint or somebody like Pope Krolos or Pope Shenouda, the late patriarch of the Coptic Orthodox Church, and write out just, questions or, please remember in your prayers this person or this person, or I have an exam tomorrow. Can you like, think little prayers like this that might be big or small. It might be about cancer treatment. It might be about anything, but people go and visit to just be close um, to holy men, and many times holy women as well, in the Egyptian context. And so this is what happens at these sites. In terms of the martyr saints, so at the 21, mausoleum, 21 Martyrs of Libya, their mausoleum, their mazar. There are also kind of prayers that people say, like hymns that people say, that people sing together, that sometimes are formal or informal. I need to follow up in terms of I recorded one of these prayers, these hymns that were prayed at the 21 Martyrs Mausoleum. Um, but essentially, it's done kind of in unison together, and it remembers the specificity of like each of the martyrs, like what they were known for, etc. It's just a way of commemoration for them, and asking for their blessings as well. So whether in written form or song, that's what's done at these kind of very holy spaces.
Struck by a couple of points that you've made as along with a recent situation that has just happened in the past week. One, that the Roman Catholic Churches has recognized these martyrs as such. Two, that the Anglican Church is openly supporting relics within religious spaces. And three, that the new Archbishop of Canterbury went on a pilgrimage leading up to her investiture, which happened just a couple of days ago. All three signs to me are commentaries on the importance of Orthodox practices. And I'm wondering if you see these three situations, but also probably even more, pointing towards a movement towards orthodoxy, that people seem to be drawn to Orthodox practices in a way that is, for me, surprising.
Yeah. So in general, there is this broader movement of conversion to Orthodox churches in the US. And I have a colleague friend, Sarah Carty Schwartz, who writes on this, particularly in conversions to the Russian Orthodox Church and the Antiochian Orthodox Church, from men, mainly conservative, former evangelical men who see the kind of traditional gender roles of the Orthodox Church, what they envision as the traditional gender roles of
Mhm.
the Orthodox Church, as being appealing to them. But that being said, there are also many converts to the Orthodox Church, across several decades, both men and women in Western contexts, et cetera, who, it's not just about these kind of conservative political perspectives. It's also very much about like the material kind of form and the preservation of what many see, I myself see as a kind of passing down of a traditional liturgical form over time. That's not to say that, there have been extensive changes over time in the Coptic Orthodox Church and other Orthodox churches. But there's this way in which I think critiques of, for example, like the Second Vatican Council, even among Catholics themselves, of shortening the liturgy, shortening the mass time, like to appeal to, to be quite frank, like modern capitalist kind of conceptions of time, and like and making sure that we're capturing the day, like let's just have 1 hour and then move on with our days. The Orthodox Church is much different. I'll give you an example, like in terms of time, like for Good Friday, as well as just the in general Holy Week, for Pesach, for Orthodox Christians, like you are in liturgy, you are in prayer for the majority of the week. Like Good Friday, you are fasting from like the morning until 5 p.m. and you are in the church. So it's just a very different orientation to the kind of almost kind of shortened down and boxed off time that many Western churches, including the Catholic Church, like has tried to kind of like, you know, we're still relevant, but like you can get on with the rest of your day. And
Mhm.
I think that people who convert to Orthodox Christianity, like, are, not, um, they want something different. They want some more meaning in their lives beyond kind of this compartmentalized understanding of religion as something you do like for an hour on Sunday, and then the rest of your week is much different. So that's what I think that the appeal is generally,
That
for
makes a
convert.
lot of sense. I think there's also a growing uh, nostalgia and a sense that what happened in the past may be more authentic than what is currently the case.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely. And I think that's also connected to the idea, though, that in a hyper-capitalist environment in which we're always trying to get like the new and next thing, that there is this kind of emptiness to that. And I think that the kind of continuity and the deep time of particularly the Orthodox churches, and particularly these very, very ancient churches of the Middle East, takes on kind of like a new significance in this moment of emptiness and frankly of loneliness and isolation, especially in like a social media age, quite frankly.
That's all true. I agree with all of those points. I'm also seeing I'm not, and it's not just me. I wish I could say I'm the only one seeing this, but a lot of people that are working in pilgrimage studies or in the tourism industry are seeing that pilgrimages are expanding, and they're also a way for ancient communities in particular to support their local economies. And I wanted to ask you about the Holy Family pilgrimage route and what that looks like and what is happening there in terms of Christian pilgrimage as national tourism.
Yeah. So this has been an initiative since, let's say, since 2015, 14. So basically, since the current president of Egypt, Sisi, took power, and it has been see and especially after COVID and like once things started like opening up, it gotten a lot more serious over the past several years. Meaning that the Holy Family Tour or the Holy Family Pilgrimage Trail is meant to bring kind of Western Christians to Egypt and see Egypt as this site, not just of like of ancient Egyptian, in some ways, like Pharaonic pilgrimage, because there are many people who come to Egypt for that, especially, but see it as also like a similarly to like Jerusalem as a place of Christian pilgrimage and going along the Holy Family Trail, in which the Holy Family came to Egypt, fled to Egypt for the period of time of Christ's like early years. And especially in Upper Egypt, you had like specific churches in which like that are churches because Christ is said to have been there or to take his first steps or etc. So this Holy Family Pilgrimage Trail has been meant to integrate these, I mean, in many ways, like kind of Coptic pilgrimage sites into a global Christian terrain and bring people to Egypt as this, seemingly, I mean, especially right now, like safe country to come and visit. Especially in this current context, I think that this particular initiative has been slowed, but there has been movement over the past several years to build more hotels because in Upper Egypt there are not, especially around these places, like there are not hotels for people to kind of stay at. So they needed to kind of build the infrastructure for this to even be possible. But more than all of these details, it marks this very specific and, let's say, contemporary moment in which Coptic Christianity in Egypt becomes even more integrated into the nationalist kind of frame of not just being this kind of subcategory in which, like, yeah, we have Pharaonic Egypt and Egypt is majority Muslim, but and we have these Christians here too, and you can go visit the Coptic Museum or Coptic Cairo and then be done with it. No, that it is an integral part of all of these sites of pilgrimage that people go to, whether it be the pyramids and the Muhammad Ali Mosque, the Citadel in Cairo. No, you're going to also go to Upper Egypt, to Minya, on your way to Luxor to see, you know, the temples, etc. So it is kind of a very unique initiative and moment to see. I mean, eventually, like if this hopefully does go somewhere, and kind of see what this new kind of Christian tourism in Egypt will look like.
The trail itself, though, begins in Egypt because certainly it's not beginning in Israel and leading into Egypt. I
Yeah.
mean,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
other conversation.
Yeah, no, it is very much a nationalist project as well, meaning that the Holy Family's flight into Egypt is about Egypt.
Hmm.
It's not necessarily, so I'm speaking from the Egyptian government perspective, like it's not necessarily about the Holy Family. It is about Egypt. And
And the
that this
sites. Is the trail a mapped trail, or this is a conceptual trail, that there are these sites that purport to have been places that the Holy Family visited and people can visit, or is it actually a linked trail?
Okay, so it's not a physically linked trail, but there are specific churches that are officially a part of it. That
Okay. Yeah, that
when
makes
I don't, I don't know anybody personally who has gone on this trail yet. What I do know is that they're still building certain infrastructure. In some places, they have built hotels to house these pilgrims, and they have renovated certain sites to allow for more pilgrims to come, because a lot of these places are very, I mean, they're local. These are local pilgrimage sites.
yes.
It's also building up the infrastructure to have hundreds of people come and visit, uh,
Mhm.
etc. So
So the sites themselves have existed for centuries or millennia, but the infrastructure is being built currently.
yes,
Okay.
yes. I mean, I know in some places, for example, in Minya, there are the infrastructure has been built, but it's still not totally complete. So again, it would be interesting to know if anybody has tried to actually do part of the trail. I don't know
Yeah,
anybody personally who has. I mean,
I
I
would be
myself.
very interested to hear about it if you learn about it. I think I would love to talk to someone who has
Yes.
completed it as a trail.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So your work now, I heard you talk about that you've moved your next project. You're probably never going to move away from the Coptic community and the research there, but you have expanded your research to another diaspora community, which is the Chaldean community.
Yeah. Without going into too many details, there are a lot of issues of naming within this community. And it's very different because the Assyrian and Chaldean community composes many different churches.
Okay.
Syriac Catholic, Chaldean Catholic, Assyrian Church of the East, Syriac Orthodox Christians. So it's a much more kind of complicated picture. But this is all to say that uh, this new project is more interested in a new kind of pilgrimage, which is to return to the homeland of what is remained, which is northern Iraq, and particularly the Nineveh Plain, which was occupied by ISIS until 2017, essentially. And since then, they've been trying to rebuild. And in this current moment, it's very sad to see how there was an opening over the past several years of people, hundreds and hundreds of Assyrian second generation, third generation people coming back to the homeland to discover their roots. And now that all of those trips this year have been canceled.
And are those trips sponsored by organizations, or it's individuals who are interested in, they hear about it from someone else and they want to be a part of this movement?
No, so there are official organizations, and I've been on a couple of these myself. So there are three major organizations, at least in kind of, let's say, the Western English speaking diaspora countries, because there are several of them that are in Germany and France as well that I'm not as well versed in, and they're much smaller. The major one is this organization called Gishru, which literally means the bridge in Assyrian. Um, so the bridge between, diaspora and homeland, as well as an organization called Nineveh Rising, which is a Chaldean organization out of Detroit, Michigan, who has done several of these homeland trips as well, and the Assyrian Aid Society, who does their own kind of, for an older generation, return to the homeland, to those that actually maybe had lived in Iraq in the 1980s, and then after fled under Saddam Hussein.
Are they classified as pilgrimages? Is that the conceptual way of seeing these
That's a
journeys?
that's a great No, that's a great question. I don't think that they would say that they're pilgrimages, because they don't. I think many people that go on them, actually most people who go on them, aside from the Nineveh Rising group, I would say, don't see it as kind of a religious um return. And
Mhm.
what I mean by that is, for Nineveh Rising, the kind of places that we would go to were mainly churches as well, and religious leaders, etc. Because there's conflicts and different kind of interests within the Assyrian kind of Chaldean diaspora, some that are more religious and some that are not as religious, and kind of see the homeland in very indigenous terms. So religion is one aspect of that indigeneity, whereas others, specifically Chaldean Catholics, will see kind of no, religion and our understanding of ourselves as indigenous to this land are one and the same with each other. There's no separation. So that's actually what the project is really trying to think about.
That's interesting. It does seem similar to other types of diaspora pilgrimages. I've called them identity pilgrimages in some of my writings because I do think that the religious piece may not be so prominent in some of these pilgrimages, but they're definitely about a return to an element of one's identity.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
How do you think your work offers a commentary on what's currently happening in the Middle East?
So I think that my work in general, especially like the second project, the commentary focus would be on the idea of what does living amidst destruction, what are the possibilities of it, and what are the possibilities of maintaining presence in a context that seeks to push you out. And so I think that even in the Egyptian context, like that is not one under which like there's missile strikes or bombardment, but it is also one in which like what does it mean to remain in even a society that discriminates against you or violently excludes you or targets you? What does it mean to like live in that society? And I guess I'll share like this last story in that, and I talk about this in chapter 2 of the book. One of my interlocutors, who I name Amin, asked me like what the greatest miracle that I've seen in Egypt was. And I really took him seriously, like, yeah, like what miracles have I seen in Egypt? And then he just kind of interrupted my thinking and was just like, no, it's the fact that, what I mean is that, we as Christians remain in this country despite all of these struggles we face. And he's an Egyptian nationalist himself. He will never even leave the village that he has lived in his whole entire life. And so I think about that too, in a place like Egypt where it is not under bombardment, but there are other ways of violence and exclusion that, make it hard for people to stay.
Yeah, that's a there's a lot to unpack in that. It yeah, it seems that if I come back to thinking about the question that I posed at the beginning of our conversation around what it means to carry a sacred homeland within when people can no longer return to their homeland, that these places of religious significance become even more prominent because it's sort of like a magnet that sacred homeland within connects, it locks into whether that is in the United States or it's in the actual homeland. But it seems that the religious communities that build up in these diaspora communities are the way that that sacred homeland can be activated and validated even outside of the actual place.
Yeah, I'll say it like along those lines. And I think it's different between the Coptic and Assyrian Chaldean communities, but especially because like Copts can go back to Egypt for the most part. Is that like you'll have a lot of Coptic Christians who will go to monasteries and like visit, Wadi Nutro and just bring back like whatever they can materially from those places, whether it just be saint cards or pieces like even dirt, that they keep like with them as like a kind of blessing. And I think that the same goes for Assyrian Chaldeans as well in Iraq or those that are visiting. And some of those are also related to their histories of experiencing genocide as well. I remember somebody who went on the most recent trip I went on a year ago, went to the site of known as it was the site of the Semele massacre, which essentially in 1933, like when the Iraqi state was kind of consolidating its national sovereignty, massacred hundreds upon hundreds of Assyrians and Chaldeans at this site. And today, there's kind of this makeshift barrier around this site that still has, I mean, bone fragment, like you can see, like, bone fragments and things like that. It's in disarray. And so it's kind of just cordoned off and like, okay, that's the site. But you have a lot of Assyrians that will go there and just like take, dirt from there as like a way to remember in diaspora their literal, genetic like legacies of genocide. So yeah, I think all of these communities, Middle Eastern Christian communities, carry the homeland within them. And Pope Pope Shenouda, I'm gonna get the phrasing wrong, but Pope Shenouda, the late patriarch of the Coptic Orthodox Church, would always say like Egypt is not a homeland that we live in, but it is a homeland that lives in us. So
Yeah,
yeah, that gets
there
you
it is.
yeah, there it is.
Yeah,
There it is.
yeah. Thank you so much for taking time to speak with me about your book and your research and your clear passion for the Coptic community and the other Orthodox communities that you're now working with. I learned so much, and it's wonderful to be able to speak with someone who has the experience that you have and has spent so much time thinking deeply about what martyrdom means and what migration means, and also looking at our constructed responses to both of these and what it means for us in the United States.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. This has been such a great conversation.